Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Reedy. I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today, we're pleased to present a conversation with a distinguished guest, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Keep in mind that the views, opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. Since unsettled weather or other technical interruptions have a chance of occurring, if you lose connection, just rejoin the session. If you lose connection and you can't get back on the net, remember that in your instructions you have a dial-in number. If we suffer a network interruption at large, we'll let it try to clear for up to a minute before issuing other instructions. If you have feedback or questions after this session, email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Today's moderator is Mr. Chuck Ricks, a non-resident senior fellow at JSOU. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thanks, Frank. It's always good to see you. And welcome to everyone to another online interview from Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing program that explores the research and publications of the JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other discussion activities. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the All Partners Access Network, or APAN, and available for streaming from the Department of Strategic Studies page on the library pages, and of course linked on social media sites. Today we are very pleased to have Dr. Sean McFate join us to talk about his thoughts as captured in his book, The New Rules of War. Thanks very much for joining us. You have a rather an eclectic background, Dr. McFate. Could you take a few moments to provide a glimpse at the various paths that you have traveled in your professional career that have brought you to where you are today?
Sure. I mean, some would say I have career ADD. I started as an officer and paratrooper in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. I then worked with Amnesty International for 2 years, which was a new way of looking at global security. And then I probably did something that no Amnesty person has done. I went from Amnesty International to becoming a private military contractor, mostly in Africa, where I worked mostly for the US government, doing things that maybe SOF or CIA traditionally would have done. And there I saw war in a new way. At least I thought it was a new way. After several years of that, I got out. I also worked for companies, mostly, well, all American companies. But I wanted to think deeply about some of the things I had seen, I had done, and I wrote many books, including New Rules of War, and also write fiction. My last book came out in June called High Treason. But fiction is also a fun way to talk about the future of war.
Okay, let's shift to the book then. You've discussed briefly your motivations, but could you go through the motivations that you had for writing the book and summarize the arguments that you intend to convey through the New Rules of War?
Sure. Well, what I would suggest, Chuck, is maybe I just launch into the presentation, which would answer some of those questions at this point.
That'd be great. Like. Thank you.
Okay, let's do that. Let's see if this all works. All right. All right. Do you have the presentation up?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I wrote this book because I was angry. I like a lot of people on this call, I think, I have lost good friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a taxpayer, I find it disgusting the trillions of dollars we've spent abroad with what I think very little to show for it. And as a vet, I find it hateful to see our national honor diminished by what I consider to be low-level foes, like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, et cetera. But the curious thing is that we have the best military in the world. I mean, even our adversaries admit this. We have the best troops, the best training, technology, money. But if we're honest with ourselves, the last time we decisively won a war was 1945, right? If we're honest with ourselves. So that's why I wrote this book. Its central question is, what's the problem? Why do we struggle? In the last 70 years of war, why have we struggled despite our superior military, et cetera? And the book is written in a readable way. It's written to be like a Vanity Fair article, but the thinking is rigorous. The thinking is, could be a Harvard University Press book. I just want it to be read so that my mother could understand it. And I'll tell you what the problem is up front. So the bottom line up front is this. The US suffers from Victor's curse. What is Victor's curse? Victor's curse is this adage, you've heard it. Generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. Now, an example of this, we'll move off the US for a second, might be 100 years ago at the end of World War I. France had a bad case of Victor's curse. And they thought the next war with Germany would look just like the last war. So they built this, the Maginot Line. Basically one of the strongest military fortifications in history. They thought the future of war would be a trench defensive position, just like World War I, a war of attrition. So they pre-built an amazing trench line, the Maginot Line. This is the Maginot Line. I'm sure many of you have actually seen it. Now, the only problem is that Germany sort of moved past, their way of warfare moved past World War II, and they created a new way of warfare called the Blitzkrieg. Now, we know how this ended, right? What the Germans could not achieve in 4 bloody years of World War I, they achieved in just 46 days in World War II, because they changed their way of warfare. This is what Victor's curse is, and we see this every day in Washington, D.C. amongst think tanks, amongst new books and articles. People think they're looking forward about the future of war, but really they're looking in the rear view mirror. They're modeling on our last successful war, which is conventional war, which is World War II. People are imagining that, the South China Sea will be replayed as some sort of midway with Ford-class carriers, F-35s, robots, AI, hypersonic missiles, and I argue that's nonsense. We have Victor's curse. We are like the French in the 1920s. The reason this is the case is, stealing a quote from management expert Peter Drucker, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Our strategic culture is lagging behind the rest of the world. And that's why adversaries from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to China and Russia can go toe-to-toe with us, not militarily, but strategically. So if I was to ask everybody, what is today's biggest threats? We could spend all morning on this question. We won't. The normal panoply of players like, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, insurgency, terrorism, yes, they are bad. And as bad as they are, though, I argue they are not the worst. There's something worse out there called durable disorder, or it's what I call durable disorder, that is giving a bump to Russia, China, or unwitting bump to terrorists and insurgents. So what is durable disorder? It's our new global environment that's been slowly creeping in for the last 30 years. And it is a systemic threat to us. It's not an actor or an agent, it's a systemic threat. It's what's left in the wake of the Westphalian Order. In the last 30 years, we've seen the Westphalian Order of nation states retreating around the world. And we've seen the rise of chaos entropy, persistent conflict, the decay of the liberal rules-based international order, the decline of states everywhere from Africa to the Middle East to Asia, the rise of non-state actors. I mean, today, the Fortune 500 are arguably more powerful than most nation states. And when we think of states, we always think about the strongest 30, not the bottom 160, right? And lastly, and also the return of mercenaries everywhere from Ukraine, Syria, Nigeria, Yemen. I mean, Libya today is a mercenary war to some extent. And overall, what we're seeing is local governance on the ground with several overlapping layers of authority and allegiance. Political scientists would call this fractured sovereignty. So this disorder, though, is not total anarchy. It's not the sky is falling, invest in more sky, or the Knights of Ni. It's just messy. It's messy, and it's not new in history. This is most of history. It looks like this is what the Middle Ages looked like. This is what antiquity looked like. This idea that nation states rule the world through international law, diplomacy, and legitimate warfare, that's the world that we were told existed in sixth grade. But that's only been the case for about 300 years. Most of human history is durable disorder. And the pendulum is swinging back to the status quo ante before it happened in Westphalian order. So a new global environment is changing warfare. And that's the core of this book. It explains how that is happening and what we have to do to win. Now, to some extent, our new national defense strategy gets at this. It recognizes global disorder is a threat. And now we're shifting from terrorism and insurgency to great power competition, particularly these two gentlemen. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. And this is not the problem of the people who wrote that strategy. It's how it's being read by the defense community. Why does everybody assume that a armed conflict with China or Russia will be a conventional fight? Why do we assume that? It's Victor's curse. It won't, I argue in this book. In fact, the very first rule of the 10 new rules of war is that conventional war is waning. Conventional war is Westphalian warfare. It's the war between states. We live in a post-Westphalian era with post-Westphalia warfare. And the numbers bear this out. So this is from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. It's considered a gold plate data set in armed conflict. This marks armed conflict since the end of World War II to 2015. Now the red line on the bottom, which is flatlined mostly, that's traditional conventional war, state-on-state warfare. The blue line is everything else. And that's a very conservative blue line because it doesn't really account for things like the genocides in Rwanda or Darfur. It doesn't account for narco wars south of our borders. But still, even with a conservative line, it clearly shows that nothing is more unconventional today than a conventional war. It's a thing of the past, like Napoleonic warfare. And essentially, no one fights conventionally anymore except for us. We have strategic atrophy, and that's why we struggle against low-level foes. And that warfare has already moved on and left us behind. So what kind of war are we preparing to fight right now? Well, the answer actually is quite easy to figure out. You have to simply look at budgets. I like to say that budgets are moral documents because they do not lie. So here's the US budget, 2019. We spend over half of our federal discretionary budget on DoD. The rest of the interagency gets what's left. So that's a pretty serious commitment to the Department of Defense. And in fact, we spend more on our military than the next biggest 7 militaries in the world combined. So anybody who's worried about an arms race with China should keep that in mind. Now, let's ask, where are we placing our bets? What are we buying? Because if you look at what we're buying, it shows you where we're placing our bets and what we think the future of war will look like. Well, here are top acquisitions from fiscal year 18. Now, looking at that list, what kind of weapons are those for? What kind of warfare? They are all conventional warfare weapons. Now, I have colleagues in the defense community who say, okay, McFate, fine, but look, all those weapons can fight unconventional fights too, you know? And my response is true. And also a Ferrari can tow a boat. It does not make it a good idea. So let's just pick on one right now, the F-35. I'm gonna pick on it because it's so easy to pick on, frankly, but it could be any one of these. So the F-35 is a super cool aircraft. We have to admit that, right? It is without doubt one of the most sophisticated machines ever thought up and built by human beings. This weapon system is both an air-to-air fighter, an air-to-ground fighter, a flying espionage platform. Its cockpit looks like a bunch of iPads. The pilot wears a helmet on his or her head that has a visor connected to sensors around the fuselage that give the pilot like X-ray vision. So he or she can see through the aircraft during a dogfight, you know? But there's only one problem with this airplane is that it's useless and obsolete in modern war. The US has been constantly at war since 9/11. This weapon has 0 combat missions. Now, the measure of worth of any weapon system is its utility. I'm an old grunt, and I used to say in the infantry, that dog don't hunt, right? Now, somewhat sensitive to this, DoD sent a few of these things over to Afghanistan in 2018 to rack up a few combat missions, but if the enemy can't shoot back, it ain't a combat mission, is what I say. And it might as well be flying over Florida and go down for engine failure. If that's the biggest risk in Afghanistan, it's not a combat mission. And the price tag is astounding. This whole program, the F-35 program, costs taxpayers and allies $1.5 trillion and counting. 1.5 trillion. That is more than Russia's GDP on a single seat airplane that doesn't go to war. In fact, if this airplane were a country, its GDP would be ranked 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia and India, right? It costs about twice as much per hour to fly, twice as much as of an F-16 or F-15, about $45,000 an hour. So think about that if you have any lieutenants listening to this. And in combat, like mock air-to-air combat tests, it's repeatedly blown out of the sky by 40-year-old F-15s and F-16s. Yet we're buying more of these, and at great opportunity cost to the weapons that we should be buying that we're not buying. This is our Maginot Line, the F-35, the Ford-class carrier, which costs $13 billion a copy. We could keep on going, these expensive conventional war weapons that are already obsolete. So this is the Maginot mentality, basically, that assuming the future wars will look like past successful ones with better technology. And that's how Washington, D.C. views future warfare. World War II with better tech. And this book says no. So we can even ask ourselves, are we already at war with Russia and China and don't know it? And that's by design, so that we're frogs being slowly boiled, for victory for them. So what does war actually look like today in durable disorder? This is what the book explains, and explains how to win. So first of all, war is getting sneakier. War is getting sneakier. So look at the Ukraine. It's a model of modern warfare. In the old rules of war, Russia would have sent in the tanks and blitzkrieged Ukraine the way they did with Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68. Now they use covert means, like Spetsnaz special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, Little Green Men, astroturfed fake separatist militia, active measures and propaganda like the Troll Factory. They manufacture the fog of war and step through it for victory. So by the time policymakers were still scratching their heads about what was really going on the ground in the fog of war, Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did conventional war weapons show up like tanks and destroyers. That is an example of current and future war. And it's not just that, it's the ballot box, right? We know that Russia tries to swing close elections. They have tried to swing US elections, Europe, EU elections, the Brexit. We know they try. We don't know how successful they are. We know that some of these are very close, like 2016 American election, the Brexit. And the strategic logic of Russia is compelling. It is this: who cares about the sword if you can control the arm that wields it? Or how about this? What, refugees? In the old rules of war, well, first, the Soviets and Russians have the same strategic objective of disuniting Europe. Now, in the old rules of war, the Soviets would have these massive military exercises on the border of East and West Germany, like Zapad 81, that looked like the Soviets were about to invade Europe. And they'd tell NATO, just relax, NATO, it's just a military exercise. But NATO didn't know, and this caused stress fractures in the alliance system. Now, when Moscow wants to cause stress fractures, they bomb refugees in Syria. And this creates or helps create an avalanche of refugees into the European Union that results in the Brexit, that results in the rise of right-wing nationalist parties across the EU who want to break up the European Union. The old Politburo would have died for such, would have loved for such an outcome. And the way that Russia's doing it is the new rules of war. Let's switch to China here. When was the last time anybody in this virtual room saw a Hollywood movie with China as the villain? Right? Last Hollywood movie where China plays the villain. We have lots of Russian villains, lots of terrorist villains, lots of Arab villains. Why no Chinese villains? Well, the reason is China bought Hollywood legally. They bought like Legendary Film Studio. Next time you see a Hollywood movie, look at first the studio pre-credits. How many of those are Mandarin? Look at how China is portrayed, like in The Martian, where they're the saviors, or there's all these movies. China is always a good guy, and the reason is, war is becoming epistemological, right? In the old rules of war, battlefield victory used to determine winners and losers. So the Clausewitzian paradigm, the conventional war paradigm. In the new rules of war, war is becoming epistemological, meaning influencing what people think and feel is how you attain victory. And Hollywood is a WMD of influence that China bought, and they're building their own Hollywood in China to eclipse ours someday, and it's doing quite well. So a few years ago, this movie came out, Wolf Warrior 2. It's like a Rambo, Chinese Rambo, against evil American Blackwater-like contractors who kill orphans in Africa, right? Sound familiar? It grossed $874 million. That's like George Clooney money, right? So they're catching up. So what does victory look like in durable disorder? Well, it's an infinite game. So winning is not conventional war. It's not the fall of Berlin in 45. It's not the signing of Japanese surrender in the Missouri in 1945. It is similar to the business cycle. You have up cycles, you have down cycles. Coca-Cola does not obliterate Pepsi, all right? And curiously, we used to think this way in the Cold War, but have forgotten how in the last 30 years, which is a conundrum to me. So to talk about how do you win in this new environment, warfare has changed, strategy has to change too. I offer 10 new rules of war. You call them principles, ideas. I don't care what you call them. But the first rule is that conventional war is over. If that happens in the future, it will not be the predominant characteristic of conflict. It'll be a high intensity moment in an otherwise longer war that will not be conventional. Most war will be unconventional, or better yet, I like to ditch the whole conventional versus unconventional, just call it war, or just call it armed conflict. Two is that technology will not save us. Now, what I mean by this is things like the F-35, these big, or the Ford-class carrier. We need technology. War is becoming epistemological. We need technological tools that make Americans savvier consumers of information and ways to disrupt, the troll factory, stuff like that. We can talk about all of this in Q&A. Rule number 3 is that there's no such thing as war or peace, both coexist. So the way conventional warriors, international public lawyers, they all think about there's war or there's peace. But it's like pregnancy, you are or you're not. But in fact, they coexist. And China uses this rule to great advantage to win the South China Sea with 0 aircraft carriers. They're exploiting rule number 3, which we can talk about in Q&A. Rule number 4 is that hearts and minds do not matter. Now, this will cause acid reflux for some people in this virtual room. What rule number 4 is, it's a critique of American counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I say, if you want to do coin correctly, I look at other things. For example, how the America settled the West in the 19th century. That's how coin is done. It's bloody, it's immoral, it takes a long time. But this whole idea of bribing populations for security does not work. We can talk about all these rules in Q&A shortly. Rule number 5 is the best weapons do not fire bullets today. It's information, it's economic warfare like Belt Road Initiative, it's diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, and other things that we're not paying enough attention to. Remember, over half of our budget goes to DoD. Rule number 6 is that mercenaries are returning. We'll talk why that, if you wish, why that's the case and why countries from Russia to the UAE and private investors are using mercenaries increasingly, and why does our IC not collect on it? Rule number 7 is now suddenly you have mercenaries in the world. Anybody who's super rich can become a superpower by swiping a check. They can rent private armies, whether it's ExxonMobil or a mega church that wants to do a humanitarian intervention someplace. You can rent Mi-24 Hind helicopters on the marketplace today. Rule number 8, now that rules 6, 7, and 8 are triptych, now that you have war is cleaving away from the nation state. So now that you have mercenaries and you have private actors, they can wage wars for any reason they want, no matter how petty. And we already have this, in the South, we call them narco states. States are now booty to be won in wars, not driving war itself. Rule number 9 is that shadow wars will dominate. Think of what's going on in Libya, Ukraine, Syria. When things get really out of control, they bubble up to the surface. We'll see them on Fox or CNN, but then they quickly go back into the shadows. That's the trajectory of modern warfare. It's not these big South China Sea Navy battles that we're imagining are some sort of version of Midway. That way of warfare is as obsolete as the Napoleonic horse charge, in my opinion. And lastly, rule number 10, victory is fungible. This means there are many ways to win wars, not just battlefield victory. In fact, battlefield victory may be obsolete. Who remembers George Bush standing on the aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished? We achieved battlefield victory. It meant nothing for the war. Victory could look like this. All of our grandkids are speaking Mandarin as a second language and are sympathetic to Beijing values. That's a form of victory. And that's what we did to Germany after World War II. Now Germans all speak English and are sympathetic to liberal American democratic values. That is, their great-grandparents would be astounded. That is what victory looks like, as one example. So Chuck, with that, I think I will turn it over to you and we can have a robust discussion around these rules or any other questions you'd like to add or ask. And I can either leave these rules up or I could stop screen sharing, whatever you prefer.
Why don't you leave them up for now? We're getting a nice collection of questions, some rather specific. Let me ask you one more general, mostly out of curiosity from reading the book and then listening to you for the last several minutes. Do you see yourself as a pessimist or an optimist? The reason I ask that is you paint a fairly bleak picture and a controversial picture for many, but every once in a while you throw in some hope. You did it on one of your slides, but in the book also you write once, good news is the world will not collapse into anarchy, and then you temper that. However, the rules-based order will crumble and be replaced by something organic and wild. So which is it, pessimist or optimist?
I'm glad that you asked that question. I'm an optimist. It's funny, I wrote this book, I thought I was doing good by suggesting, hey, warfare has changed, and here's how we can win in modern armed conflict, which is essentially an optimistic message. But I find that a lot of people are still sort of like shock and awe over my initial sort of supposition that the situation is changed as we assume, I'm challenging conventional wisdom, but ultimately an optimist. I mean, if we employ these rules, I believe, we could do well. I do think spending billions of dollars on what I consider obsolete conventional war weapons at great opportunity cost to other things, that is where I'm pessimistic. But overall, if we can change the way we think about war, we can succeed.
Okay, let me go to the first question from the audience. How do you think that climate change, and the writer or the questioner appropriately says, let's not go down the rabbit hole of what causes it, but how do you think climate change will affect future military operations, and what can SOF do to prepare for those changes?
That's a great question. Climate change is not something I tackle in this book because it deserves its own book, frankly. I think climate change, I look at these things that climate change it's a driver of conflict. It can cause migrations, food insecurity, and certainly places like the Maldives are very concerned about it. They will drive new types of conflict, and in places that maybe we're not paying attention to. But I still think that warfare is, I still would subscribe to the 10 new rules of war. How those wars, transcribe will look like the 10 new rules of war. I think in general, this type of warfare that I'm describing is more of a soft fight than it is of a a conventional military fight. One of the things I suggest in this book is that the rest of the military needs to become more soft-like. I do not say it needs to become all soft. That is not feasible, nor is it desirable. But I think that there's important principles from the warrior ethos of SOF for how SOF fights that I think the rest of the military can and should benefit from. So I hope that answers your question.
How would you recommend changing U.S. military defense strategy as represented in the NDS to more appropriately face the way of war in the world as you see it, optimistically?
Yeah, boy, I wish I had that power of the pen for that. So I think the National Defense Strategy of 2018 is well written. I think it's being received in a disappointing way, and I think sometimes it's being sold in wrong ways. The first thing that I would do if I was, SecDef, if I had a magic wand, is I would slash DoD's budget. I think, DoD's budget is outrageous, and it's causing the false security of our own Maginot mentality by investing these big end, high-end, weapons that don't go to war. I would do some other things too, like this is a little bit more than the NDS. I think, first of all, for the NDS, I would move us from a Clausewitzian strategic logic to a Sun Tzuian strategic logic, and that recognizing that modern wars is as much deception as it is of kinetic firepower, and we have to force structure and create a new strategy around that. Also, I would change up the military. I think, why is it always that the military is, the Army is an infantry guy usually, the Air Force is usually a fighter pilot, the Navy is usually a fighter pilot or a submariner, the Marine's always a Marine. Let's change it up. Maybe we should have a soft 4-star or an Intel 4-star, and that would also change culture. I think our strategic culture has to change, and not just our strategy. Going back to the earlier quote, that the culture eats strategy for breakfast. But I would love to actually a deeper dive in that question. I don't have time for right now, but I think we should start again, especially in national security strategy, actually.
Okay, we also have several questions in the line of issues and how they affect SOF, and I think those are important. Where do you stand on the idea that future wars will be urban and or fought in mega cities? And if you agree with that premise, what should SOF do to adapt its training and doctrine to prepare for this change?
So I think mega cities are a phenomenon we should pay attention to, but I think recent literature in the last 10 years have been overwrought. I mean, if you look at conflicts in the last 10 years, they have not taken place in mega cities as some people have suggested. I mean, there's Syria, there's Afghanistan, there's Sahel, there's Libya. These are not mega cities. So I think that the mega cities are an important phenomenon. We have to think about mount operations and how we'd operate. But I don't think that war is all mega cities, as some have suggested. How do we think about mega cities? How do we do operations in mega cities? You know, I'm a little bit old school, but I would, look at Battle of Algiers, the movie, which was advised by the actual insurgent leader. I forget his name. But I think if you're going to fight in mega cities, you have to prepare for a lot of human rights violations. And that may be one of the reasons why adversaries might use mega cities as sort of literally a human shield. And I don't know how we get beyond that other than having more Americans join the armed forces. So hear me out here. So right now, less than 1% of America volunteers to serve in the military, which puts a huge burden on those who do, obviously, which people feel. But in this situation, it's very easy to go to war and demand no casualties because Americans are so removed from warfare, they have no skin in the game. They just want to flex American muscle, but they don't want anybody to come back dead. And this warps our operational art in horrible ways. I think if more Americans served in the military, they would see that war is bloody and awful, and we'd have a much more elevated discourse in what we were prepared to do and where we were prepared to fight, and that would include megacities.
I've got several responses and questions to your F-35 comments. Let me bundle them briefly and then have you respond. Haven't the Israelis used the F-35 in combat missions? And another one, similar track or parallel track, what should we be buying? And then finally, a little longer here, the F-35 does a lot more than conventional warfare. This platform has solidified partnerships with allies and partners like Japan, Australia, and Singapore in Asia. This program is a glue for worldwide operations, same platform, same maintenance, same tools, same command and control. Using the same platforms means we speak similar operational language with partners and are interoperable. So if you don't mind kind of a general reaction to those kinds of comments, please.
Let me start with the last one and work backwards. So I think that's a position that Lockheed and its lobbyists frankly put out every day. I disagree with it. I think that it's not worth the bang for buck is not there. Okay, I just don't, if the money that we're spending on the F-35 is, if we want to shore up alliances, maybe we fund the State Department instead, right? I mean, that's the things that we need to be talking about. I don't think a weapon system that doesn't go to war is the way to do it. And that's controversial to people who defend the F-35, but let's also not forget that the last time there was a strategic dogfight was the Korean War. We could even ask, why are we even buying fighter jets, much less like manned fighter jets at this point in time, right? So I strongly, obviously we diverge on this point. I think the F-35 does do multiple missions, but doesn't do them very well. So even Lockheed would say that, yeah, I mean, the A-10 is better at air to ground. The F-22 is better, or the F-16 or 15 are better at air to air, counter air. And we have other platforms that already do espionage. So is there really, if some would say that the F-35 is a horse, people say that the old joke is that a camel is a horse, is a committee, trying to, decide on a horse. So I think its effectiveness is overstated. When current platforms seem to be doing the job okay. And, yes, it can do all these other things, but again, I don't think that, our adversaries / enemies are not going to attack us on a head-on conventional war because it's suicide. So they're going to come at us using irregular war because they know that the US is terrible at fighting it. So we have this assumption that we're going we're going to put money behind our strengths rather than putting money behind our weaknesses and make them stronger. And that's what I'm calling for in this book. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying we should scrap our superlative conventional forces. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we don't need more of them. Again, the Ford-class carrier is $13 billion a ship. That's more than SOCOM's budget, right, for a ship. And do we need more of them? So that, and there's questions about the military-industrial complex, et cetera, which some people will probably ask. But that's why I think the F-35 is not worth the bang for the buck. Now, what should we be investing in instead? That's a good question. So here's some things. Like, we have global supply chain security problems, right? We're vulnerable with our global supply chain. Like, what is in the F-35 that's made overseas? Do we have to worry about that? We have no vetting, really, no substantial vetting for any of our industrial base for these types of things. Not enough. How do we make Americans more savvy to information warfare, right? So one way is, the problem of clickbait, right? So we wear clothes that tell us where this shirt's made. It's made in Vietnam, Bangladesh, for some of you, Italy, I'm sure, right? So what if we could label where each clickbait is made? This clickbait is, made in North Korea. This clickbait is made in Iran. Would that impact information choices of the American people? I mean, and are there things that we should be investing in, like the dark arts of disinformation? I'm not saying we should, but let's have the conversation. Because right now we're playing, our information and operations strategy is largely, we're on defense. We're like a goalie at a penalty shootout. And maybe we should be playing a little bit more offense. I'm not advocating that. I'm just advocating for a conversation about that.
An approach we've had is from several people trying to privately convey emails. We'll do that afterwards, but I want you to know that so we don't lose it in the closeout here later. Next question: do you think that existing SOF authorities are adequate to successfully operate below armed conflict? And if not, what else might be necessary or appropriate?
So that's a great question. And I don't think that they're adequate. I think our whole legal structure, from our domestic law to laws of armed conflict, is essentially mired in the Westphalian way of warfare, conventional war. But we don't fight conventionally. Nobody fights conventionally anymore. I don't think anybody's going to do that. There's been a few exceptions, but they've been total exceptions, and most of them are 50 years ago. So I do think that authorities, et cetera, need to be updated. How they should be updated, I'm not the expert to talk to you about that. But I do think that this whole idea of a threshold of war, if you look at rule number 3, I don't believe there's a threshold of war. I think that there's armed conflict, full spectrum, and that's it. There's no bright line between war and peace, and our adversaries use this against us. This is what China does in South China Sea. They go right up to the brink of war, and then they stop when we would say, if you cross that line, we go to war. But they keep everything they capture or they create. And done enough times, the slow incrementalism is winning them the South China Sea using strategy, not through aircraft carriers, right? They're exploiting rule number 3. They're exploiting this false dichotomy in our head about war versus peace. We have to realize that there's war and peace. We used to think this way in the Cold War. We've forgotten how in the last 30 years. So let's ditch this threshold of war stuff. Let's think a little bit broader, think bigger, and have authorities that match. Unfortunately, usually it takes for a victorious nation like ours to change our way of warfare, which the authorities' questions really gets at. It takes a lot of blood. And sometimes not even then. I mean, France didn't learn much after World War I. They built the Maginot Line. So I think that's one of the purposes of this book, is to start a conversation about what things like authorities and SOF need to be attuned to modern warfare. It's a start a conversation, not to end one though. It's a start a conversation.
Do you have any thoughts or views or assessments on the new U.S. Agency for Global Media?
I don't. I like, actions speak louder than words. We'll see. I mean, the U.S. Information Agency that was shut down in the 1990s, people bemoaned in 2005, 2007. Although what that looks like today, I do not know. The State Department has been struggling with this. We have things like the Smith-Mundt Act that were written in the late 50s that touch on some of these issues of how not propagandizing U.S. citizens abroad. We need to think about information warfare in ways that our adversaries are. But here's what we know is that if war is getting sneakier, meaning it's getting more secretive, and there's things like media and media manipulation even, if war is getting more secretive, we know from the 1970s Church Committee hearings that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So if I'm advocating we have to go into the shadows to punch back, we just can't be playing goalie at a penalty shootout all day. How do we do that and not lose our democratic soul? How do we wage war in secret but not sacrifice our democracy? But that's the question we should be having about national security today, not how many F-35s and Ford-class carriers are needed. It's how do democracies fight secret wars and not lose their soul?
Do you have any thoughts on the reality of nuclear weapons and how their presence, their reality might unfold based on the new rules of war? Huge costs involved, obviously, and if we drop our guard, we cannot recover.
Right. So nuclear weapons are an area that I briefly touch on in this book, but that could deserve its own rule. So I discussed this idea that we can't expect the nuclear taboo to last forever, and that there could be limited nuclear war, looking at India-Pakistan scenarios where Pakistan uses a nuke on its own territory to beat back an Indian invasion, right? What would that look like? And then once a nuclear taboo is broken, then could there be things like lateral escalation in the Middle East, that Iran develops a nuclear weapon, just say Saudi Arabia, for example, might potentially buy one from Pakistan, Israel has nuclear weapons, and what happens if you have a accidental warfare moment, like 1914, but in the Middle East today with nukes? Will nukes just be seen as a big bomb eventually, the way that, say, Truman and MacArthur kind of looked at them arguably early in the Korean War? So I think we have to think about a world with nuclear weapons. Is it going to look like the Cuban Missile Crisis could have looked like? I don't know. But I think that, we have to be savvy to nuclear weapons. I don't know if they're ever going to fall out of hands of states because they're so expensive and hard to produce. But there are those more expert than me on the future of nuclear weapons.
Something you just said reminded me to ask you, now that the book has been published and you've been involved with debates and presentations such as this, have you had any second thoughts about the rules? For instance, just now you said the nuclear issue may, cause a new rule. So have you thought about taking out one, putting one in, or maybe adding two for an even dozen or three for a baker's dozen?
Well, when I was writing this book, I had everything from 5 to 15 rules at one point. So, it's possible I will write a sequel. I'm not sure if we'll have 10 rules, it might be 5, but there are things that need to be on here, like economic warfare, maybe something more specifically information warfare, nuclear warfare, and other types of conflict, right? So I absolutely agree. Other things that I would do is I would change the title for rule number 1 and 4, because the chapter lays it out clearly what I mean, but when people kind of breeze through the rules, they oh, conventional war is dead, and they walk away, or rule number 4, coin sucks, and they walk away. I lay it out in a more sophisticated way in a chapter, as any writer would do. But maybe I would soften the title a little bit. But once it's in ink, it's kind of hard to soften ink.
John Rendon, who founded the Rendon Group, he's a global strategist, has for some years argued that governments and countries need to pay as much attention to street craft as they do to statecraft. And of course, those include things like the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and what's happening now domestically here. We've got a couple of questions along that line. Let me ask them individually, even though there's some overlap perhaps. Given the depth of anarchist activity in the Western US and that the eastern portions of states of Washington and Oregon say they want to secede and join Idaho, what do you see for the immediate future of that area and for that whole kind of thinking domestically?
So if you look at rule number 10, victory is fungible, this would fall under that. So there's many ways to win wars. It's not just battlefield victory like Waterloo, Gettysburg, Midway. We know that our country is going through a culture war right now. Red state versus blue state, Fox versus CNN, patriot versus, progressive, whatever labels, we understand that's going on. Now, we know that democracies are messy. And if we're having an organic family feud, that's okay. But that's not what's going on. We have external powers reaching in, finding the seams of fabric in our society and wrenching it apart. They're taking current vulnerabilities and they're fanning the flames that are there, that were already there. They're not creating the problem. They're not creating the flames. They're just dumping kerosene on it or JP4 on it. That's a way to win, to subvert democracies from the inside out so a country can collapse that way is more effective today than a blitzkrieg onto the shores of California and the Eastern Seaboard, right? So to some extent, is that going on? This was a question during the 1960s. FBI Hoover thought Soviet agents were behind the anti-war movements, et cetera, and they created COINTELPRO, this notorious domestic counterinsurgency program that is now clearly outlawed. So that is certainly a threat. Now, I don't know if it's a significant threat. I don't know if like Russia and others are, I don't know how successful they are. But we also know that Russia, for example, is terrified or paranoid about color revolutions. And one of the things I suggest in rule number 9 is, why don't we start a few, right? If you want to get China out of the South China Sea, the question, is Hong Kong a artificial color revolution? Many in the Pacific Rim think that the US is behind Hong Kong. Could we start color revolutions like in the west of China? Could we start color revolutions of places in Russia? So that is sort of rule number 9. So not only are we trying to defend ourselves, but should we consider these dark arts ourselves? And what's the cost of saying no? I don't answer. I just want to put the question on the table for modern strategists.
In a related question along some of those lines and bringing it back domestically, what kind of measures, you cite the failures of the 60s and what was done, all accurately, by the way. How do we approach now what could be domestic disruption techniques externally? What kind of measures can we take or should we take as part of an overall deterrence strategy in our area or environment of durable disorder?
So this is where we're going on to, there be dragons here territory. The first thing that we can try to do is create, how do you create resiliency on the home front? Laws and institutions and so forth. And that is not my bailiwick. There are others who can talk about that. But unfortunately, in my opinion, that debate has become so politicized that it's hard to have meaningful discourse right now. And that may be by accident, maybe by design. I think our America's chief vulnerability is ourselves in many ways. It's not China or, it's not great power competition, it's ourselves that I think our adversaries are using. I think though, if you're thinking about an offensive strategy is maybe we need to, we create deterrence, not by sailing aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf or the South China Sea, that does nothing, I think, is you hit back in rule number 9, you hit back in the shadows. You mess with us, we mess with you. Of course, this risks lateral escalation and a security dilemma. All sorts of problems are risks with it. But I think if you want to put autocracies on their heels, we have to think about doing some of that and how far. So one of the things, I mean, if you look at these rules of war, it favors autocracy. There's no question about it. And that's one of the reasons why autocracies are doing well today, is because the global environment favors, war, for lack of a better word, in the broadest sense possible. I'm not advocating for that, and I'm not advocating we become more autocratic. That's the question I asked about democracy and secrets. But we have to recognize that. And if we want to keep Moscow out of our internal affairs, I think we mess with their internal affairs. We have color revolutions. We try to create paranoia between Putin and his inner circle, so he takes out half of his inner circle for us. There's all sorts of tricks that we could do if we're willing. The question is we're willing, and is that the wisest strategy? And that's, again, open for debate. I'm not pushing anything. I just want to put things on the table.
The next is a comment and then a question. The hearts and minds approach is a constraint on how we approach military operations, and that's expected by our society. In today's media environment, our military could not adopt the methods used in the winning of the West. How do we incorporate more of the approach that is necessary and still maintain the support of the people for the military operation?
So that's a great question. And what rule number 4 goes, it critiques, analyzes, criticizes hearts and minds coin as we practiced it in Iraq and Afghanistan as to why that can't win. And it can't win because populations are not bribable. China can't go to Detroit and say, look, we'll give you free healthcare, free schools, free food, and we'll build you a football stadium. And all you got to do is vote communist in your next congressional election because we're fielding a congressional candidate in every district of the US. People of Detroit would take all the stuff, but would still not vote communist. That was our strategy for COIN, and it didn't work. Now to do COIN, there's 3 ways you do COIN. One is coercion, killing lots of people, lots of collateral damage. 2 is you do import. So you import your own people into someone else's homeland, so they become a minority in their own homeland. And you do export. You take their people and you move them elsewhere so that they become a minority in somebody else's homeland. And we did all 3 of those things in the 19th century with Native American Indians, right? We did coercion, we did, Trail of Tears, we did white settlers moving in, etc. And it worked. It's immoral, it takes a long time, and it's awful. I don't think we can do that today. But I make mention of it in rule number 4 so that people don't rush in on another insurgency mission thinking that, unicorns and rainbows, if we just give them the opportunity to vote, they want to be like us, and we'll have democratic peace theory after that. I don't believe in that. I think that we have to respect that. And so this is, my answer to your question is, I don't think we can do counterinsurgency, because to do counterinsurgency correctly is not a thing that Americans would find acceptable.
This is a good one for you, coming from the PME environment. You talk about developing strategic leaders, considering the May 2020 memo from the JCS concerning joint PME. What advice would you have for the services or for the PME institutions to develop the kinds of strategic-minded leaders who can develop or who can generate the effects you write about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could spend all day, I won't, on this question as a professor at a war college. Look, I think in some ways we have the best PME system in the world. In other ways, it needs a lot of updating. We are still, I think, mired in the past, not mired in the future. The things that I would like to see is we need more critical thinking. So at the tactical and operational levels of war, it's more engineering thinking, meaning that here are principles to fight and win in a tactical environment, an operational environment, we call it doctrine. And that could derive some success, right? And you can learn that in staff colleges, but at the war college level, we're talking about strategic thinking. You need to be a good critical thinker, a creative thinker. It's not superior to engineering thinking. It's a different type of thinking. Unfortunately, by the time we get to strategic level education, colonels already have 15 to 20 years in. Why do we wait so long? Let's do strategic level education when people are cadets, when people are midshipmen. Let's create liberal arts to help hone it. So when you read like the Brothers Karamazov, a Russian 19th century novel, you could read it about 19th century Russian society, but it also has lots of themes to think about humanity and humankind to develop your sort of critical thinking capacity. I think we need something more like that. And also I talk about like Ender's Game, not to make too much of Ender's Game. It's a science fiction book from the 80s, which is interesting, but we need to be more creative in how we approach our strategic thinking. We need to create war artists that can improvise with modern war the way jazz musicians do. That's what we need. We don't need people in lockstep about how we, I'll stop there, but we need to find creative ways to teach this. And I think we also need to get off of Clausewitz. I mean, Clausewitz has a place, but we should take him off the war altar. And war is becoming more like Sun Tzu, more like Mao. We should be reading stuff like that more often. So I could keep on going. I'll stop there, but I would fundamentally revamp some of PME at the strategic level.
We have a question that talks about Rule 8, wars without states, and in this case, wars without borders. And the questioner is focusing on south of the US border, where criminals have already pre-visualized engagement with other Central and South American actors to move throughout North America, creating effects. And he cites some specific examples of what he's talking about. What specific concerns or what specific initiatives are open to us to address that problem? Not only the instability, but cooperative instability?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, one of the problems we have is that our bureaucracy and our strategic culture is essentially Westphalian, meaning that we have state-centric goggles on. And we see everything, and this is also academia, and political science has the same problem. There's the state and then there's the sub-state, and everything is sub-state, right? And that is just, does not cleave to reality. So curiously, we look at narcos in Mexico as criminal gangs and not a war, right? Even though people on the ground view it as a war. And it's funny what we privilege as war. So somehow in the Middle East, insurgents are considered war, but criminal gangs are considered not war. They're considered criminality. It's a sub-state issue. In 2018, I think IISS, a think tank in London, said, ranked where is the most combat deaths in the world. Number 1 was Syria. Number 2 was Mexico. Number 3 was Iraq. Number 4 was Afghanistan. And, so I think we need to sort of have a IISS vision of this and a non-state centric vision of this. And we need to have, I talk about the new rules of war. We also need a new rules of diplomacy. Why can't we reach out to, non-state entities like narcos and make sort of, if you will, some sort of peace treaty with them, or, try to manage them as we manage states? We don't. We just sort of look down on our nose and say it's an FBI issue. It's not even a military issue. It's an FBI issue or something, or a DEA issue or something like that. So I think Latin America is an example of the old rules of war not working today. And so, what should we be doing is a different question. What could we be doing? We could be treating it more like a war and less like a crime problem.
The current engagement against communist China on the seas is increasing our experiences with the Soviet Navy years ago of scraping at sea like bumper cars to demonstrate will. What does our Navy need to do to be successful in this new fight, this new confrontation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the South China Sea is to use a bad pun, a bit of a tempest in a teapot. Now that's going to be strong language for some in the room, but here's why. Is like, yeah, there's a lot of posturing going on there between the two navies. But I think if we really want to get China out of South China Sea, it's not going to be by scraping, destroyer on destroyer. It's not going to be, this conventional war escalation. I think what we need to do is we need to find the fissures of Chinese society and then covertly rip them apart. We need to create an acting insurgency in the West. We need to get paranoia amongst the inner circle of the autocrats and the autocrat inner circle. So we create distrust. They tear each other apart. We need to do domestic messaging to the Chinese people, sort of a covert public diplomacy program about how your elites are ripping you off, as well as to other parts of the world like Africa, where Belt Road Initiative is, and using lawfare there as well. And I think if you start to do all these things in concert, I mean, if using lawfare to disrupt Belt Road Initiative, if you do all these things in concert, I think we'll get China's mind off the South China Sea, and that's how you do it. It's not bull on bull in the South China Sea, and freedom of navigation operations has limited effect. I think the way you do it is using new rules of war. It raises important questions about how much of this is acceptable to the American people, but that's the line of questioning that I want to create, not answer.
In a related question, it's a longer one, I'm just going to paraphrase it. Is it the case that we are now in a Cold War with China, but only one side is acknowledging that? Because of course that opens up all sorts of possibilities and establishes all sorts of restrictions.
It's a good question too, because look, Cold War is an interesting metaphor. First of all, when I teach at Georgetown too, and I have grad students who, like, to them, the Cold War might as well have been, the Peloponnesian War. It seems like a very distant thing. And I know there's people on this call who grew of age in the ranks, perhaps, during the Cold War. And they will tell you that the Cold War was not so cold. It was not just a metaphor. It was a real something. And I think we're having the same debate today. We've forgotten what cold versus hot war is. You have this binary thing. You're at war, you're at peace. When in fact, in terms of rule number 3, you have both. Right? It's war and peace. So in some ways, I do think that we're in a Cold War. I don't like using the term Cold War because suddenly people start using our experience with the Soviets as a direct analog to China, which is wrong for many reasons. But I do think it's more like the Cold War than anything else. So I think we need to think about this. And I think a lot of people do. And I think Americans, especially in the defense community, intuitively know that we are, there is some sort of Cold War going on. But then it gets to questions of authorities and thresholds of war, which I think are the wrong strategic questions to ask. I mean, you can't get past authorities. I'm not suggesting illegality, but I think that we need to have a broader conversation, which we may not be able to have in this current congressional environment, but we need to have a broader strategic conversation about how do we marshal all instruments of national power to contend with China.
We have a few more questions, and I think there's value in continuing to the bottom of the list if you are available, sir. This is really 2 questions in one. What do you see as the role of the United States and international organizations, United Nations, World Health Organization, World Bank? And then related, how would you recommend we build better partnerships with other nations?
Good question. So I think that, look, America has spent the last 70 years really creating the international system in its image, right? And but there seems to be a fatigue with it, and that's part of Make America Great campaigns, appeal, is that a lot of Americans feel that we are overinvested in international organizations, that international organizations have, especially in terms of war and peace, have proven a disappointment, starting with the Balkans, looking at Iraq, looking at Afghanistan, especially looking at Syria, Libya today. The UN arms embargo is the biggest joke in Africa. So there's a fatigue of international organizations which are expensive and don't seem to be, many think don't seem to be worth it. So there could be a retrenchment away from international organizations. And we're seeing this also in Europe. But this is the question of what are we giving something up is a good question, and people have debated that. And usually it comes down to something like this. Well, if you think the UN is inefficient or bad, imagine the world without a UN. Well, that's a counterfactual argument. Doesn't make it right, it doesn't make it wrong, but it's just not a very useful argument. I think America has to, right now we have this, there are many people saying we need to recreate a liberal world order like Bob Kagan. To me, this is a Humpty Dumpty approach to foreign policy. The liberal world order that we imagine is, I think, more fiction than fact. And also, even if it's possible to do that, I'm not sure it's desirable, because being world cop for that world order is, I don't think, very feasible or desirable. So I think right now we have to rethink our role in the world, and maybe it's okay that we are not the unilateral hegemon. In fact, you could argue we were not the unilateral hegemon except for some, 1993, 1994. The world did not turn out as Fukuyama predicted, with this sort of liberal capitalist end of history moment of no more political strife. Far from it. So I think we need to rethink our role in the world. What we really need, and I talk about this in the book, is we need a new grand strategy to chart out that course. And there are people in DC who are cynical about grand strategy, which I think is wrong and dangerous. We're not posed to do it today in today's political environment, which may have some help from our adversaries. But we need a grant like an NSC 68, not to replicate NSC 68, but something that gives us direction as a nation. We don't have that, as everybody knows.
These sessions over the years have proven very valuable, not only in presenting viewpoints, but also in generating some debate. And typically at the end, we ask the speaker to add on anything he or she would like to add on, to clarify or to expand upon comments. We have a question here that might allow you to do that as well. So having listened to you now, so for America to win, we should then focus on applying unrestricted warfare.
I assume that the commentator is referring to the 1999 Chinese doctrine of unrestricted warfare. What I suggest is we need to consider somewhere on that spectrum. It's not an either or, but there's an extreme version of unrestricted warfare. There's a less extreme version, but the answer is a qualified yes. We should consider it, right? And that's very controversial, but I think right now it's also controversial to suggest that the world, as we're preparing for it with conventional weapons, I think there's rule number 10, there's many ways to win, but there's also many ways to lose. And I think that right now we are arguably already at war with China and maybe even Russia. So if we need more of an unrestricted warfare mentality, I would agree with that, but not to the extreme. I don't want to be this is not a black and white issue, it's a spectrum.
We just had a question come in, and it's one there's been some interest in anyway. I'm going to ask this. You talk in various settings, including the book, about the French Foreign Legion as a model for perhaps an American Foreign Legion, and the employment of such forces in the zones of disorder. What kind of structure would that look like? What roles would such a force play? And perhaps more controversially, are the American people and the Congress ready for such a organization?
So this book is not a screed. It's not just like, here's problems, deal with it. The book has a lot of potential solutions too, but they're controversial solutions on purpose to move the needle, because I find anodyne solutions on white papers from think tanks generally don't get noticed these days. But it's not just me trying to scream, but one of the ideas, for example, is the idea of an American Foreign Legion. So modeled in some ways after the French Foreign Legion. So when you think of the French Foreign Legion, you're thinking, I'm reading people's thought bubbles, you're thinking mercenaries, you're thinking Jean-Claude Van Damme, right? That's not what the French Foreign Legion is. The French Foreign Legion it's an army unit, part of the French armed forces. It has French officers. It fights only for France. It's like any other military unit, except it's enlisted, come from all over the world, and they work for citizenship. And this would solve problems of, unreliable contractors. Right now, we use contractors. So when we want to put boots on the ground someplace, we have three terrible choices. Either it's boots on the ground like Iraq, which is bad. It's using unreliable contractors, which is bad because contractors, we can go on about that, but they're not really very accountable. And there's unreliable proxies, which have their own interests in mind. Having this, a foreign legion, allows us to stay in zones of disorder that we care about for long periods of time. Americans care about dead soldiers. They don't care about dead foreigners or dead contractors. We know that for a fact. So in this case, military commanders can actually take risks to achieve objectives. Because right now, military commanders goes places, and often, maybe not soft, but often it's like it's a force protection mission at the end of the day. Here's your mission, but don't lose anybody. That's the higher mission. So having a foreign legion gives us some staying power and oomph in places that we care about, and they're there on a semi-permanent mission, semi-permanent time period, not like 3 months or RIPTOA problems is every 9 months. They're there for the long haul, and they get to learn how local societies fight and they interact with them, and et cetera. So I think this would be if we care about zones of disorder, this is a much more effective way than just pure soft interventions, airstrikes, stuff like that. And it avoids proxies, contractors, and big boots in the ground missions. So it's just one of the many ideas in this book that are unorthodox, but I think we should think about some of these unorthodox solutions if it just makes us a little bit more cognitively agile about what we really do want to do.
Well, I think that takes us to the bottom of the list of questions. And Dr. McFate, thank you so very much for taking the time to share your expertise, your ideas, and to stimulate some great discussion and a certain modicum of rational debate. Thanks also to everyone who tuned in, and I hope you got a lot out of it. There was a lot here, and so many of you contributed, again, with your questions and comments. For feedback on this session or any Think JSOU activity, please contact us by email at thinkjsou@socom.mil. I'd like to close once again by encouraging everybody to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library, APAN, or on JSOU's social media sites. It's all there. The US SOCOM Library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. And many of these monographs reach back about 18 years or so, and you can capture the history of the last decades. And of course, you can always check out upcoming events and courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University. And once again, thanks all of you for joining us and participating so aggressively. We'll see you later. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.